Frodo Baggins sat upon a fallen tree at the edge of the company's camp, eyes hooded and glimmering with a private trouble that none could fully see. It was dusk, the sky awash in crimson, and the shadows of twisted boughs seemed to dance ominously upon the ground. The ring lay hidden within his vest, yet its presence was felt as keenly as the chill in the air. Sam hovered near his master, concern written on his kind features, but the rest of the fellowship stood apart. Aragorn, Legolas, Gimli, Merry, Pippin, Boromir, and Gandalf, watching him with uneasy hearts. They had all sensed the shift in Frodo's demeanor these last few days. His voice had grown curt, his eyes distant, and his once unyielding kindness seemed frayed by an anger that flared on occasion like a hidden ember suddenly catching the wind. If such small changes had merely been attributed to wariness or fear, none would speak up, but it was not so. The darkness of the ring seemed to settle around him like a black cloak, and each member of the company silently wondered if that darkness was already too deep to dispel. The uneasy hush that lay between them was finally broken by Boromir's troubled sigh. Once his longing for the ring had made him suspect in the eyes of the fellowship, but now it seemed the tide had turned. "Look at him," he said softly, almost regretfully. "He scarcely sleeps." His words to Samwise have grown so short that even Sam, gentle as he is, can hardly hide his hurt. "And I have seen him fingering that cursed thing in the night." He spoke as though each word tasted of bitterness. Aragorn did not answer at first, but his brow was heavily furrowed. Legolas, keen-eyed even in the gloaming, nodded once in acknowledgement of the shift in Frodo. Gandalf, pipe in hand, studied the hobbit from beneath bushy eyebrows with a grave expression. "We must proceed with caution," the wizard said quietly. "Great burdens may twist the spirit, yet we must not judge hastily." Merry and Pippin, who usually leavened any gloom with jokes and songs, stood to one side as though at a loss. They could not fathom life without Frodo's warmth and leadership, for they still remembered the dear cousin who had read them stories under old oak trees and scolded them gently whenever they overstepped themselves. Yet the day had changed them all, and even those hobbits' hearts grew heavy with dread. Frodo, seemingly aware of the company's distant murmurings, stood up from the trunk and paced around the clearing with an impatience that was unsettling to behold. Sam tried to speak comforting words, but Frodo brushed him off in a hushed tone that none could quite decipher. When at last he stood near Gandalf and the others, there was a steely gleam in Frodo's eyes that made them shift uncomfortably. In that moment, the fellowship glimpsed the subtle reflection of a will not entirely his own, as though something cold and malicious peered out from behind his gaze. As the last rays of day faded behind the darkening tree line, the fellowship gathered close around the small, crackling fire, their faces lit from below by the dancing orange glow. The conversation began tentatively, with many downward glances and half-formed sentences, until Boromir mustered the courage to speak his heart. "Frodo Baggins, dear companion," Boromir said carefully, voice thick with concern, "we cannot deny what we have witnessed. Shadows gather swiftly in the heart, especially one burdened as heavily as yours. We know you struggle with the weight of the ring, but these days we sense a change in you, one that makes us fear for your well-being and the success of our quest." Frodo bristled at the words, and his hand stole to his chest where the ring was secreted. "Do you doubt my resolve?" he demanded. His usually soft voice was sharp, and the mild hobbit they knew seemed to vanish in that instant. A tension bled into the clearing, as if the air itself had grown heavier. Aragorn spoke next, stepping closer with a measured calm that only a ranger-turned heir of kings could manage. "None here doubt the greatness of your courage," he said gently, "but we cannot blind ourselves to signs that you might be compromised." A flicker of something akin to fury lit Frodo's eyes, and Sam took a step forward protectively, but Gandalf raised a hand for peace, his expression deeply sorrowful. "Frodo," the wizard murmured, "we must talk of these things openly, lest suspicion fester in our ranks. We stand upon a razor's edge, and trust is our only salvation." No one noticed Merry and Pippin wiping tears from their eyes, or Gimli gently lowering his gaze in an awkward attempt to spare Frodo's pride. Legolas's own eyes were bright with pity and yet alert to any sudden move that might prove dangerous. The thought that Frodo, the innocent ring-bearer, might already be lost to the ring's corruption was almost unthinkable. Yet here they were, arrayed against him in an unspoken union. Frodo sensed the solidarity they had formed, the hush that fell in their wake, and it stung his heart. In truth, he was frightened by the slow, creeping darkness inside him, a relentless whisper that urged him towards solitary paths and defensive acts. But in that moment, the fear turned outward, forging anger against those who questioned him. "You think I have failed already?" he whispered, voice trembling with contained emotion. "All of you, even Sam." "No, Mr. Frodo," Sam said, choking on the words. "I'd never think so poorly of you." He fidgeted, uncertain how to mend the schism opening before them. Yet Frodo seemed unconvinced, and the sting of betrayal, real or imagined, burned in his features. The conversation ended in silence, the matter hanging over them like a threat. Gandalf at last quietly asked Frodo to rest, and the hobbit retreated from the fire's warmth, curling into his cloak at the edges of camp. The Fellowship lingered, exchanging worried looks, for suspicion now weighed upon them all. Would the ring-bearer remain their ally, or was darkness indeed blooming in his heart? Morning rose with a pale, wintry light that did little to warm their spirits. Frodo avoided eye contact, his face set in grim lines. The rest of the Fellowship broke their fast in silence, and Sam valiantly tried to encourage Frodo to eat something more than a nibble, but the ring-bearer would have none of it. Instead, standing watchful at the perimeter of the clearing, scanning the tree line for threats unseen, Merry and Pippin approached him, offering jokes about second breakfasts and the importance of a sturdy meal. But Frodo's answering smile was thin, as if forced through a pain none of them could share. The gentle banter died away, leaving them again in an uneasy hush. When they set forth, the path led them through a forest older than memory, full of twisted roots and thick moss that clung to every surface. The hush of the morning persisted. Even the birds seemed reluctant to sing. As hours slipped by, Frodo trudged ahead with a fierceness at odds with his small stature, spurred on by the weight of the ring. Aragorn, normally at the lead, found himself relegated to second in line, exchanging worried glances with Gandalf. Boromir too studied Frodo's movements closely, his own misgivings haunting him like a shadow. The hobbit's shoulders were tense, and he spoke little beyond commands for direction. The further they journeyed, the more certain the Fellowship grew that Frodo was wrestling not merely with the ring's burden, but with suspicion and bitterness toward them. As the day wore on, Gandalf finally called for a halt near a shallow brook gurgling through a mossy hollow. Water dripped from overhanging branches, forming gentle plinks against the surface. Sam was the first to collect water, offering Frodo a freshly filled flask. Yet when their eyes met, there was a flash of haunted understanding. Frodo accepted the gift, but said nothing, the tension between them almost tangible. With the afternoon sun waning, the Fellowship began to realize that the malaise besetting them could only grow worse if left unaddressed. Indeed, if doubt festered in their hearts, it would be as much a threat as any orc army or twisting corridor in the mines of Moria. It was then that Gandalf, staff in hand, called them to gather upon a patch of green. "We can no longer sidestep this crisis," he declared. His voice was a low rumble that carried throughout the hollow. "Frodo, you bear the One Ring, a device of pure malice, but your spirit is stronger than you know. Still, we have observed changes in you, and we fear you may be succumbing to its call. We beseech you, let us help you, for if you stray too far into darkness, we shall all be lost." A hush settled among the group. Frodo gazed at them from under furrowed brows. Deep within his eyes a storm raged, and though a part of him longed to cast off the burden and weep upon Sam's shoulder, he instead drew his cloak around himself. "Help me," he repeated bitterly. "You speak as though I am an errant child in need of scolding. You speak as though you no longer trust me." Gandalf looked stricken, yet he persisted gently. "We do trust you, Frodo, but the ring sows seeds of discord. It seeks to isolate you from us, to make you believe you stand alone." The wizard's words were gentle yet firm, weighted with a wisdom older than the forest around them. "Stand with us, Frodo," Gandalf pleaded. "Do not retreat into yourself. or we are doomed." But Frodo's suspicions, fanned by the ring's silent whispers, found deeper purchase in his heart. He recalled Boromir's earlier condemnation, the worried glances from Aragorn, the pity in Gandalf's gaze, and Sam's trembling lip. Did they pity him? Did they think him weak, already consumed by evil? The very notion of their mistrust stung worse than an orc's blade. "You do not know my mind," he snapped, his voice carrying a bitter edge. "You do not know the burden I bear every waking moment." His voice cracked, and for an instant his eyes shone with unshed tears. "I will not be your prisoner." That single defiant statement, echoing in the forest, seemed to fracture the Fellowship's heart. Boromir's eyes widened, as though he saw in Frodo's outburst a reflection of his own darker impulses. Legolas's gaze flickered with alarm, and Gimli gripped the haft of his axe nervously. Merry and Pippin, who had held hands behind their backs in silent hope, gasped at the venom in their cousin's tone. Sam lowered his head, tears spilling unchecked down his cheeks. In that moment, the Fellowship recognized that the line between ally and enemy was shifting. Confusion reigned as Frodo took a step backward, his right hand creeping toward the ring. Sam, seeing the motion, cried out, "No, Mr. Frodo, don't!" The rest of the company prepared to react, though they did not know what to do. Gandalf merely raised his staff, light glinting off its tip, while Aragorn put a hand on the hilt of Anduril. The moment stretched, taut as a bowstring. Each heart thundered with dread. If Frodo tried to wield the ring against them, it might mean a fate worse than death. Had they truly driven him to such extremes by their fear and suspicion? Slowly, painfully, Frodo let his hand drop. A palpable sigh of relief swept through the clearing, though the tension remained like a bruise that wouldn't fade. Yet the hobbit's face was set in a mask of hurt and anger. "I am going," he said at last, voice trembling, "to complete the quest. Alone, if need be. But I cannot do it under your accusing eyes." The choice to part from the Fellowship might have come upon them all eventually, but none had expected it so soon or under such clouded circumstances. Silence greeted his words, until at last Gandalf spoke in a voice etched with sorrow. "Then we have failed you, Frodo. Or perhaps you have fallen under the sway of Sauron's malice more deeply than we feared. Whichever the case, I cannot let you wander off alone." The wizard's eyes flickered, not with anger, but with an undeniable resolve. Something changed then in the Fellowship's demeanor, a subtle but unmistakable shift that rendered the group no longer a cohesive band around Frodo, but a line of guardians who stood between him and the wild. Boromir's grip tightened on his sword. Aragorn stood ready, a resolute light in his eyes. Gimli set his feet apart, steady as an oak. Legolas nocked an arrow, though he did not draw it. Merry and Pippin hovered uncertainly, fear etched across their faces, and Sam took one trembling step forward. "Frodo," he said more softly than before, "we can't let you go off on your own. Please, let us help." But in Frodo's mind, fueled by the ring's insidious murmur, their concern transformed into tyranny. He saw prison bars in the ranks of his friends, saw condemnation in their eyes. Panicked, he whirled, seeking an escape route. The forest's gloom beckoned from all sides. Gandalf, sensing the hobbit's intention, lifted his staff to cast a light barrier. A faint shimmering in the air coalesced, as if the wizard had woven threads of starlight into a net. "Do not force my hand, Frodo," Gandalf warned. "I desire no harm upon you." A strangled cry escaped Frodo's lips, and he backed away, only to find Aragorn already moving to block his path. "This must not become violence," Aragorn said, though the steely determination in his eyes told another story. The others closed in, each uncertain but compelled by necessity. Frodo's breath came in ragged gasps. He turned to Sam, the last lifeline of trust, but Sam's eyes were full of anguish. "I won't let them hurt you, Mr. Frodo," Sam said, "but I won't let you hurt yourself neither." For a moment the ring-bearer trembled on the edge of reason. Then, with a cry that was half sorrow, half fury, Frodo seized the chain around his neck and pulled the ring out into the open. Its golden surface glimmered in the afternoon light, and even the birds above fell silent at its unveiling. A weight like 1,000 hammers pressed upon the Fellowship's spirits, and all of them, from Gandalf to Gimli, felt the lure of that dreadful object. But they also felt a sudden fear. Fear that Frodo would claim it and vanish from their sight. Fear that he might turn its power upon them. "Frodo, no!" Sam begged, taking a single step forward. "Don't put it on!" Boromir's hand twitched toward his sword hilt, as though he must forcibly stop the hobbit. But it was too late. In a motion born of desperation, Frodo slipped the ring onto his finger. The world seemed to shudder, a ripple of unseen force passing through the clearing. The hobbit disappeared from their sight, leaving only disturbed leaves where he had stood. The Fellowship gasped in unison, hearts lurching. "He's gone invisible!" Legolas cried, his keen eyes futilely scanning the empty air. Gandalf raised his staff high, muttering words in an ancient tongue, summoning a swirl of faint light that revealed blurry footprints in the grass. Aragorn lunged forward, but in the confusion Frodo darted between them, intangible and unseen, fleeing toward the forest's depths. With an anguished shout, Sam tried to follow, but Gandalf held him back. "Stay your haste, Samwise. He is still Frodo, but in the clutches of the ring's power. Running blind after him may cause more harm." The wizard closed his eyes, focusing on the subtle currents of magic that traced Frodo's path. "It leads south," Gandalf murmured, eyes still shut. "He is heading deeper into the woods, perhaps aiming for the hills beyond. We must follow, and we must not let him out of reach." The Fellowship glanced at one another. Even Boromir's anger had melted into horror. He remembered his own moment of weakness atop Amon Hen, how the ring's voice had hissed in his mind, and now that same voice snared Frodo more fully than ever. If they failed to reclaim him, Middle-earth itself might pay the price. Nodding in silent agreement, they readied their gear and prepared to pursue. The chase was a nightmare. Frodo, invisible and driven by fear, frustration, and perhaps madness, moved through the forest like a will-o'-the-wisp, leaving only crushed undergrowth in his wake. The Fellowship stumbled behind, guided by Gandalf's faint magical tracking and Sam's uncanny ability to guess which paths Frodo might choose. All the while, the forest grew darker and more labyrinthine, as though it wished to hide its new fugitive. Twisted roots caught at their ankles, low branches scraped their faces, and unseen crevices threatened to send them tumbling. It became clear that the forest itself was uneasy, as if it felt the presence of the One Ring and recoiled. A few hours before sunset, they came upon a clearing strewn with large boulders half buried in moss. Traces of footprints and snapped branches led them here. At the clearing's edge, Gandalf lifted his staff, which glowed pale blue, revealing the faint outline of a hobbit crouched behind a boulder. The figure's edges shimmered unnaturally in the dying light. Frodo was there, invisible yet half revealed, breathing heavily. The Fellowship moved forward carefully, hearts pounding. Sam's voice trembled as he spoke. "Frodo, please, we can sort this out. Please just take off the ring." For a moment the figure did not move, as though Frodo wrestled fiercely within. Then, with a shaky sigh, he removed the ring from his finger, reappearing in their midst. The hobbit's face was haggard, eyes rimmed with red, and he looked at them with a mixture of resentment and despair. In the hush that followed, Gandalf dared to take a step closer. "Let me hold it for but a moment," he said quietly, extending his hand. "Just to ease your burden." Frodo recoiled instantly, hugging the ring to his chest. "No," he whispered. "None shall touch it but me." A tense standoff ensued, with the Fellowship encircling Frodo. Each of their faces mirrored some facet of heartbreak. Gimli's stoic grief, Legolas's sad determination, Merry and Pippin's helpless sorrow, and Boromir's grim recollection of his own failings. Even Sam stood uncertain, arms hanging by his sides, tears wetting his cheeks. Gandalf lowered his hand. "We will not force your hand," he said, though the weight in his voice spoke of heavy regret. "But your flight, your anger, Frodo, it cannot go on like this." Slowly, Frodo's eyes found Sam's, and the ring-bearer's voice cracked with emotion. I only wanted to finish our quest. I never asked for all this doubt. Boromir, who knew too well the ring's seductive power, stepped forward. "Doubt is the weapon of the enemy, Frodo," he said, voice laden with remorse. "It used me against you once. Do not let it claim you as well." The hobbit gazed at him, torn between empathy and resentment, for Boromir's words rang true in his heart. Yet the fear of being overpowered, of being treated as a danger rather than a friend, still clung to him. In that moment, a gust of wind rustled through the clearing, carrying with it the scent of damp moss and the faintest trace of decay. It was as though the woods mourned the unraveling fellowship. "Come with us," Aragorn urged softly. "Return to our side of your own accord and we shall trust you. We will help you carry this burden." Frodo swallowed hard, shoulders trembling. "Trust me," he muttered, bitterly twisting the words. "It is not me you should trust, but the fate that has chosen me. None can remove this burden from my shoulders. It is mine alone." Again his eyes flashed, as if the ring's voice rose in protest to sharing any measure of control. At last, Samwise found the courage to speak. "Mr. Frodo, if you can't trust them, trust me," he pleaded. "I'd follow you to the ends of Middle-earth, but I can't do that if you're running from us. Let's set aside blame and fear. Let's just try to be ourselves again." The sincerity of Sam's plea seemed to pierce Frodo's armor of suspicion. Slowly, he uncurled his fingers from around the ring, letting it rest against his chest. Tears welled in his eyes, and for the first time in days, he looked more like the frightened but determined hobbit who had set out from Rivendell. Yet before relief could wash over them, a chilling laugh echoed from the far side of the clearing, seeming to come from the gloom beneath an ancient oak. The Fellowship whirled, weapons readied. Out of the dim light slithered a creature of malevolent grace, an emissary of Sauron, perhaps a twisted spirit clothed in a tattered cloak, pallid face half hidden by shadows. Its eyes glowed with a sickly greenish light, and its voice hissed like wind through dead leaves. "Yes, little ring-bearer, cling to your precious illusions," it sneered, ignoring the bristling warriors around it. "Suspect your friends, quarrel in the dust. The eye sees the seeds of betrayal in your midst." Lightning quick, Aragorn lunged forward, but the wraith-like figure vanished into a swirl of shadow. Boromir and Gimli rushed to the spot, blades ready, but it was gone. Only a faint echo of malicious laughter lingered in the silent air. The sudden intrusion rattled the Fellowship, reminding them that the enemy's servants could be anywhere, ready to exploit any schism. Gandalf closed his eyes and sighed heavily. "We have tarried too long in strife," he said. "We must move on, and we must do so together." All eyes turned back to Frodo, who stood trembling. The presence of that messenger of darkness had only deepened his doubts, reminding him that evil was not merely in the outside world, it was also creeping within his own heart. He pressed the ring to his chest, struggling for composure. At last he bowed his head. "I will go on, with you," he whispered, voice laced with uncertainty and lingering fear. "But know this, I cannot abide your eyes upon me if you think I am already lost." His voice trembled, but behind his words was a plea for understanding. Samwise stepped up and gently wrapped an arm around Frodo's shoulders. "Then we'll watch over you only out of love, not suspicion," he said. And though Frodo did not return the embrace, neither did he pull away. Merry and Pippin, tears of relief streaming down their cheeks, offered shaky smiles. Legolas lowered his bow, and Gimli exhaled a breath he did not realize he had been holding. Boromir sheathed his sword, though he gave Frodo a long, contemplative look, perhaps seeing in him a reflection of his own vulnerabilities. Gandalf at last nodded, letting his staff's light fade. "So be it," the wizard pronounced, voice echoing in the stillness. "We stand united, though sorrow may attend our steps." And so the Fellowship pressed on, fragile and haunted, the memory of their near fracture weighing heavily upon their hearts. Their journey would take them across harsh plains, treacherous mountain passes, and into the black chasms of lands under the shadow. At every turn they glanced at Frodo with worry, and though the ring-bearer marched resolutely onward, his eyes never quite lost that flicker of distrust. Still, a quiet understanding settled among them all that day. If there was any hope to destroy the ring, it lay not just in the strength of arms or cunning of wits, but in the fragile bonds of fellowship that had bent almost to breaking, and might do so again. Days bled into weeks, and the forests gave way to rocky hills that bit at their ankles with jagged edges. In the nights, they camped in tense silence, always keeping Frodo within sight, yet striving not to intrude upon his solitude. Though many attempts were made to lighten the mood, Pippin's silly songs, Merry's stories of old times in the Shire, Gimli's rough-hewn humour, and Legolas's soft, lilting elvish lays, none of these entirely dispelled the gloom that had settled like a leaden cloak upon them. Boromir especially kept his distance, as if ashamed of his prior failings and afraid that closeness might reopen wounds. Frodo himself retreated deeper into introspection. At times he would sit alone on a boulder or at the edge of a fire's glow, turning the ring over in his hands, face etched with an unbearable sorrow. Sam remained an ever-faithful shadow, but even Sam's gentle presence could not entirely shield Frodo from the creeping sense of corruption. For in Frodo's dreams, he saw a great eye, rimmed with flame, searching for him through all the lands of Middle-earth. And in his waking moments, he felt the darkness tugging at his thoughts, urging him to distrust every ally, to see only doom in their company. Gandalf, who sensed these dark tides, tried to counsel Frodo whenever a moment presented itself. The wizard would speak of courage, of hope, of the necessity to trust others in such desperate times. But Frodo, often polite out of old habit, would nod and murmur vague answers, his gaze distant. The wounds of suspicion had cut him deeply, and healing would not come swiftly. Meanwhile, tensions simmered between the others. They all wanted to protect Frodo, but how to protect a friend from a foe that lived within his very soul? At length, they approached the boundaries of a barren land that stretched out before them like a bleached bone under the sun. Scraggly bushes and twisted shrubs were the only sign of life. Here, they huddled in the lee of a rocky outcropping, seeking a plan for crossing the harsh terrain. "There will be watchers," Aragorn warned, pointing to the horizon where vague shapes might signal an enemy outpost. "We must proceed under cover of night," Gandalf agreed, setting out a strategy that required stealth and cunning. There was no time for further quarrel. The outside threat demanded their focus. Night fell, cold and merciless. The Fellowship began to traverse the rocky expanse, hearts pounding in the stillness. Each footstep felt amplified, though the ground swallowed their noise. The moon was but a sliver, offering little guidance, and so they relied on Gandalf's staff for faint illumination and Legolas's elvish eyes. Frodo trudged on with grim determination, occasionally stumbling as if the ring's weight pressed him down more than ever. Sam was always at his side to steady him, but the ring-bearer scarcely acknowledged these gestures, his mind swirling with thoughts of betrayal, of burdens, of the unstoppable gaze of Sauron. And so it went, a slow and perilous march under the cloak of night, with the Fellowship united in a fragile alliance that threatened to break at every gust of distrust. Yet a glimmer of hope remained, a recognition that despite their fears, they had not abandoned Frodo when they might have turned away in anger or despair. Indeed, some part of Frodo clung to that hope as well, though it was battered and bruised within him. He remembered the Shire, the taste of fresh bread, the laughter of friends, and the old stories of heroism that once seemed so distant. Could he ever return to such light now that suspicion had tainted his bond with his companions? In the hush before dawn, when the sky was on the cusp of paling, they reached a ridge that overlooked a valley of jagged rocks shaped like broken teeth. Weariness tugged at them, and so they found a sheltered crevice to rest in for a few hours. There, in the dim hush, Frodo finally looked around at the Fellowship as they slumped onto their packs and tried to find some measure of comfort. He saw Gandalf's face lined with concern, Aragorn lost in thought, Legolas scanning the horizon, Gimli fussing with a dull axe blade, Boromir rubbing his temples in fatigue, Merry and Pippin clinging to each other for solace, and Sam nodding off against a rock, yet still half awake if Frodo so much as stirred. A sense of guilt, deeper than the caverns of Moria, gnawed at Frodo's heart. These people had risked life and limb to accompany him, to protect him. He knew the ring twisted perceptions, sowed enmity, kindled fear. Yet the specter of their accusing looks still haunted him. The memory of that day in the forest when they surrounded him, questioned him, forced him to reveal the ring. He closed his eyes, silently begging for any measure of forgiveness, both for them and for himself. Sleep came at last, a restless slumber beset by faint nightmares of betrayal and darkness. When dawn broke over the ridge, the Fellowship rose to continue their journey, uncertain yet determined. The path would be longer still, and the battle within Frodo's heart raged on, a fight as crucial as the war itself. Though suspicion had scarred their bond, the Fellowship marched on, unified by purpose, if not by perfect trust. Perhaps, in time, loyalty and sacrifice would heal the wounds, or perhaps the seeds of discord would bloom in the darkness, leading them to a doom none could foresee. Such is the perilous road of those who carry the fate of Middle-earth upon their shoulders, and who must stand together or perish under the ever-watchful eye.